First Geneva Convention, Chapter 4, Article 24. Medical personnel exclusively engaged in the search for or the collection, transport or treatment of the wounded, sick, or in the prevention of disease. Staff exclusively engaged in administration of medical units and establishment, as well as chaplains attached to the armed forces, shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. Article 25. Members of the armed forces, specially trained for employment, should the need arise, as hospital orderlies, nurses, auxiliaries, stretcher bearers, in the search of or the collection, transport, or treatment of the wounded and sick, shall likewise be respected and protected if they are carrying out these duties at the time when they come into contact with the enemy or fall into his hands. Article 26. The staff of the National Red Cross Societies and that of other voluntary aid societies duly recognized and authorized by their governments who may be employed on the same duties as personnel named in Article 24 are placed on the same footing as the personnel named in said article, provided that the staff of such societies are subject to military laws and regulations. Each high contracting party shall notify to the other, either in the time of peace or at the commencement or during of hostilities, but in any case before actually employing them, the names of the societies which it has authorized under its the names of the societies which it has authorized under its responsibilities to render assistance to the regular medical service of its armed forces. Article 27. A recognized society of a neutral country can only lend the assistance of its medical personnel and units to a party to the conflict with the previous consent of its own government and the authorization of the party to the conflict concerned. That personnel and those units shall be placed under the control of that party to the conflict. The neutral government shall notify this consent to the adversary of the state which accepts such assistance. The party to the conflict who accepts such assistance is bound to notify the adverse party thereof before making any use of it. In no circumstances shall this assistance be considered as interference in the conflict. The members of the personnel named in the first paragraph shall be duly furnished with the identity cards provided in Article 40 before leaving the neutral country to which they belong. Article 28. Personnel designated in Articles 24 and Articles 26 who fall into the hands of the adverse party shall be retained only insofar as the state of health, spiritual needs, and the number of prisoners of war require. Personnel thus retained should not be deemed prisoners of war. Nevertheless, they shall at least benefit by all the provisions of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war of August 12, 1949, within the framework of the military laws and the regulations of the detaining power, and under the authority of its competent service. They shall continue to carry out, in accordance with their professional ethics and their medical and spiritual duties, on behalf of the prisoners of war, preferably those of the armed forces to which they themselves belong. They shall further enjoy the following facilities for the carrying out of their medical and spiritual duties. They shall be authorized to visit periodically the prisoners of war in the labor units or in the hospitals outside the camp. Detaining power shall put at their disposal the means of transport required. In each camp, the senior medical officer of the highest rank shall be responsible to the military authorities of the camp for the professional activity of the retained medical personnel. For this purpose, from the outbreak of hostilities The parties to the conflict shall agree regarding the corresponding seniority of the ranks of their medical personnel, including those of societies designated in Article 26. In all questions arising out of their duties, this medical officer and the chaplain shall have direct access to the military and medical authorities of the camp, who shall grant them the facilities they may require for the correspondence relating to these questions. Although retained personnel in a camp shall be subject to its internal discipline, they shall not, however, be required to perform any work outside their medical or religious duties. During hostilities, the parties to the conflict shall make arrangements for relieving, where possible, retained personnel, and shall settle the procedure of such relief. None of the preceding provisions shall relieve the detaining power of the obligations imposed upon it with regard to the medical and spiritual welfare of the prisoners of war. Article 29. Members of the personnel designated in Article 25 who have fallen into the hands of the enemy shall be prisoners of war, but shall be employed on their medical duties insofar as the need arises. Article 30. Personnel whose retention is not indispensable by virtue of the provisions of Article 28 shall be returned to the party of the conflict to whom they belong as soon as the road is open for their return and military requirements permit. Pending their return, they shall not be deemed prisoners of war. Nevertheless, they shall at least benefit by all the provisions of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, August 12, 1949. They shall continue to fulfill their duties under the orders of the adverse parties, and shall preferably be engaged in the care of the wounded and sick and of the party to the conflict to which they themselves belong. On their departure, they shall take with them the effects of the personal belongings, valuables, and instruments belonging to them. 31. The selection of personnel for the return under Article 30 shall be made introspective of any consideration of race, religion, or political opinion, but preferably according to the chronological order of their capture and the state of their health. As from the outbreak of hostilities, parties to the conflict may be determined by special agreement of the preceding personnel to be retained in proportion to the number of their prisoners and the distribution of the said personnel in the camps. Article 30. Persons designated in Article 27 who have fallen into the hands of the adverse party may not be detained. Unless otherwise agreed, they shall have permission to return to their country, or if this is not possible, to the territory of the party to the conflict in whose service they were, as soon as the route for their return is open and military considerations permit. Pending their release, they shall continue their work under the direction of the adverse party. They shall preferably be engaged in the care of the wounded and of the sick of the party to the conflict in whose service they were. On their departure, they shall take with them their effects, personnel, articles, and valuables, and the instruments, arms, and, if possible, means of transports belonging to them. The parties to the conflict shall secure to this personnel, while in their power, the same food, lodging, allowances, and pay as are granted to the corresponding personnel of their armed forces. The food shall in any case be sufficient as regards quantity, quality, and variety to keep said personnel in a normal state of health. Any violations of the Geneva Conventions should be reported to the proper authorities. Document. Report. Prosecute.